The most recent translation of Elena Ferrante that Ann has done, of course, is the book that we're going to be talking about this evening, The Lying Life of Adults, which came out in September of last year, debuted at number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, and has been great success for us and giving us great pleasure and satisfaction as the book's publisher. And I think before we get into our conversation, which is going to be sort of wide-ranging this evening, I think we're going to hear just a little bit of Ann's translation read by Ann. So over to you, Ann.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Boulder Bookstore. Also, I'll just give a little bit of a setup of the reading in the beginning of the novel. The first person narrator is called Giovanna Trada, and she's 12 years old when the story begins. She lives with her school teacher parents in a middle-class neighborhood of Naples. And one night she overhears her father saying that she's getting ugly. I mean, he doesn't say that literally. He says that she's getting the face of Vittoria, who is his sister from whom he's estranged, and in whom, Giovanna says, ugliness and spite were combined to perfection, as I had heard him say as long as I could remember. Giovanna becomes obsessed by a desire to meet her aunt, who still lives in the working class neighborhood where her father grew up. So this is her first. She finally convinces her father or parents that she should meet her aunt, and so her father is now taking her to visit. After days of rain, Sunday was beautiful with a blue sky and occasional little white clouds. My father made an effort to return to our usual lighthearted relationship, but when he started the car, he became silent. He hated the ring road and got off it quickly. He said he preferred the old streets, and as we made our way into another city made up of rows of small, bleak apartment buildings, faded walls, industrial warehouses and sheds, gashes of green overflowing with garbage of every sort, deep puddles filled by the recent rain, putrid air, he became increasingly somber. Then he seemed to decide that he couldn't leave me in silence, as if he had forgotten about me, and for the first time mentioned his origins. I was born and grew up in this neighborhood here, he said, with a broad gesture that embraced beyond the windshield walls of tufa, gray, yellow, and pink apartment buildings. My family was poor. We didn't even have 2 cents to rub together. Then he drove into an even bleaker neighborhood, stopped, sighed with irritation, pointed to a brick building whose facade was missing large patches of plaster. Here's where I lived, he said, and where Aunt Vittoria still lives. I looked at him, frightened. He noticed. What's wrong? Don't go. I won't move. What if she keeps me? When you're tired, you'll say, I have to go now. What if she doesn't let me go? I'll come and get you. No, don't. I'll come. All right. I got out of the car, went through the entrance. There was a strong odor of garbage mixed with the aroma of Sunday sauces. I didn't see an elevator. I climbed up uneven, broken steps beside walls showing broad white wounds, one so deep it seemed like a hole dug out to hide something. I avoided deciphering obscene sayings and drawings. I had other urgencies. My father had been a child and a boy in this building. I counted the floors. On the third I stopped. There were 3 doors. The one on my right was the only one that displayed a surname, and pasted to the wood was a strip of paper on which was written in pen, Trada. I rang the bell, held my breath. Nothing. I counted slowly to 40. My father had told me some years earlier that whenever you're in a state of uncertainty, you should do that. When I got to 41, I rang again. The second electrical charge seemed exaggeratedly loud. A shout in dialect reached me, an explosion of hoarse sounds, and God damn it, what's the hurry, I'm coming. Then decisive steps, a key that turned 4 times in the lock. The door opened. A woman dressed all in blue appeared, tall, with a great mass of very black hair arranged on her neck, as thin as a post, and yet with broad shoulders and a large chest. She held a lighted cigarette between her fingers. She coughed and said, moving back and forth between Italian and dialect, "What's the matter? You're sick? You have to pee?" "No." "So why do you ring twice?" I murmured, "I'm Giovanna, Aunt." "I know you're Giovanna, but if you call me Aunt again, you'd better turn right around and get out of here." I nodded yes. I was frightened. I looked for a few seconds at her face without makeup, then stared at the floor. Vittoria seemed to me to have a beauty so unbearable that to consider her ugly became a necessity. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. You've left us with a cliffhanger, the first encounter between Giovanna and Vittoria. Can I ask, I mean, you're not only the translator of this book by Elena Ferrante, but the translator of all of Elena Ferrante's works into English. 3 novels prior to the Neapolitan novels, a big work of nonfiction, a children's book, and then of course the great undertaking, the 2,000 pages or whatever it was of the Neapolitan novels, and now the Lying Life of Adults. Was there anything sort of noticeably different about this book for you as a translator compared with those other books that you've translated?
I think the point of view is different. I mean, the point of view is a teenager, first of all. I mean, it's a person. It's not, as you know from the first paragraph, it's a person who's older who's looking back, but she's very much in the mind of the teenager, and I think that's very different from her other books, which were also. I mean, they're all first-person narratives, but the other books, including the earlier books, are told by women who are somewhat older. Well, the Neapolitan novels, obviously, by women in her 60s, the others by women in her, let's say, 40s, 30s, or 40s. Anyway, a grown-up, an adult, a lying adult, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that the teenager perspective is somewhat different. I mean, a lot of the themes and the subjects are similar. I mean, it's about a woman, it's about women's relationships with each other, women's relationships with men, sex, bodies, women's friendships, girls and their mothers, in this case also girls and their fathers. But it's very much from this I guess Giovanna's 12 at the beginning and she's 16 at the end. So it's like the most intense years of an adolescent girl's life, when one of, for example, the body, she's very obsessed with her body, which is sort of more than in the other books. I mean, that's just one example, but she's a teenager. And I think that was different and in some ways difficult for me because I didn't want to go back to being a teenager.
The difficulties then were emotional rather than technical.
Yeah, right. They weren't technical. Yeah. I mean, I think technically the difficulties are pretty much the same.
And what are those difficulties when you're comparing maybe difficulties or joys or ease, maybe, I don't know. But what are the peculiarities of translating Ferrante when compared with other authors that you've translated?
Her sentences are very, they tend to be run on, as people say. I mean, she tends to want to get a lot into every sentence. And she also has they also have a kind of, I think Roxana Robinson used the word velocity, and a kind of propulsiveness to them that pull you in and make you want to keep reading. And sometimes it's hard to keep that in a English syntax, to keep that kind of velocity. Italian supports that kind of run-on feeling much more easily than English. English is like just crying out for that pause. That grammatical pause.
That style of writing that you translate so well certainly pulls you on as a reader. Does it pull you on as a translator as well? Do you have difficulty stopping sometimes or knowing where to stop exactly?
Yes, absolutely. Because sometimes you can follow the Italian syntax, just reproduce it in English, but a lot of times you can't, and you have to figure out like how to stop it, maybe not with a new sentence, but let's say with a semicolon or a colon or something. But you have to do it in order not to break the flow of the meaning of the sentence. So sometimes that's hard because Ferrante she wants to get somewhere in these sentences. She's usually, aiming at something, and you don't want to put a wrench in the works of where she's aiming to
Yeah.
go.
You know, are there sensibilities that you think make for a good translator?
Well, you just named the word. I mean, Primo Levi, writing about translation, talked about how a good translator needs to have, above all, besides being able to make a sort of a literal, let's say literal or more or less literal translation, has to have a linguistic sensibility. That was his term. And he thought that was, he said, that's really the most important quality in a translator. I mean, of course, that could mean many things, but I think basically it means having a feeling for language, for both languages, I think, is what he meant. I mean, he was translating from German into Italian, and he was struggling with that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, but isn't there?
Yes, there was a lot going on. Right. Plus, he was translating Kafka.
Yeah. What about sort of not only the relationship to language, but the relationship to specific authors or to specific books? Do you think that it's necessary to share some sensibility or some sympathy with a particular author or a book to translate that book or author well?
No, I don't. I mean, I think sort of a little bit what I was saying before. I mean, with every book, you're going to learn something. You learn something, even if it's an author you feel sort of antithetical to. I can't really think offhand of a translation I've done that I felt that way about the author, but sometimes I haven't liked a book. And I think that you do gain some sympathy with the author, or sometimes you get less sympathy with the author, but because you're always, at least for me, because I'm always looking at the language as the language, as well as the language of that author, I think that I always, get something out of it, even if it's not an author that's congenial. I mean, of course, if the author is congenial, it's a lot easier, I think. Or you might say it's too easy. No, it's never too easy. But it's, I think that you can always translate even an author that you don't like, or even writing that you don't like.
Yeah.
Even if it's very hard.
And starting with sort of, beginning with your role as a translator and what a long, strange trip that must have been, because as I'm sure everybody knows, Ferrante has chosen not to be a public person as a writer. She as she says, writes her books, and that's all she does for them. And somewhat as a consequence of that, Anne has become a bit of an avatar, a bit of a face of Ferrante, which is sort of a strange twist, I think, for a translator. Although, I think it's maybe also becoming more common in some ways as well. So, I mean, how's that been for you? How do you, do you enjoy that role? Do you not? Is it a burden?
Well, I mean, I think it continues to be surprising to me that I mean, people want to have a person to connect to a book. I mean, of course they want the book, but it seems to be useful for people to have a person connected to the book. I mean, I'm not the author, and I always make that very clear. I can't speak the way the author of a book would speak about the book, but I do feel, well, two things. One is that I'm happy to be the face of these, some face of these books, even if it's only the translator's face, because I love the books. And I think that if people like to talk about them, I'm happy to talk about them. But I also think it's been really good for translators. I mean, I think people forget that there's a translator between them and the book that they're reading. I just happened to have read a review today that quoted huge amounts of Ferrante and never even mentioned the fact that there was a translator involved.
Yeah.
And that's not uncommon. But so I think it's good for people to remember that. I mean, I didn't write the book, but I did write the English prose that you're reading. So I think that's a good thing about it. I mean, and applies to all translators, of course. But
Yeah.
but it is strange to be. I mean, I remember the first time somebody asked me to sign a book, and I thought, oh, that's really weird. Why do they want my signature? But you know, it's, I understand it in some way.
I've been sitting next to you a couple of times when that's happened, and then occasionally someone said, "Well, why don't you sign it too?" to me, and I thought, "Well, it's getting even weirder."
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
What
mean,
are you doing
yeah.
signing these books?
And you have it, and you've also been representing.
Yeah.
So,
Do you think? I mean, it seems to me that the sort of the gambit here with Ferrante is that not being present as an author will sort of necessitate on the part of readers, first of all, I think, you know, the point that she's making, that it is really for readers, but will necessitate sort of a deeper engagement in the books, because you don't have the author to tweet at or to ask or to get an, you know, to send an email to, or to look at an interview or things like that. And I know certainly for me that's been true because of the, you know, I'm much more involved in Ferrante's books than I often am for many other books, because we're doing these events, we're talking about the books a lot. Do you find that has been a part of sort of your experience of these books as well, that there's a deeper engagement because of this role that you have to play?
I don't know if
you choose to play.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that just slipped out.
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's hard to separate between that and between the fact that, to me, I mean, Ferrante's books are kind of, I mean, I feel kind of personally involved in them anyway, because they're first person narratives. Most of them are narrated by a woman of, let's say, well, especially in the Apollon quartets, let's say of my age, a person who's lived the same part of the 20th century as I have, the 20th and 21st. Whoops. So I felt with her books, and actually with the earlier books too, a kind of deeper engagement than I might with another book, with, let's say, you know, Elsa Morante, for example, or something. I mean, you always feel a particular engagement with at least I do, with the first person narrator, but the Ferrante books are particular. And I guess, and I think that without an author, there is something even, you know, more, there's less of a, what would you say, like a barrier? I mean, it's like there's some kind of smarginatura, a dissolving boundary between me and the narrator, or me and the author of the book. You know, whoever that author is, the author of the book is, in a sense, some creation who's creating that book.